Hi, this video will teach you how to enter your vendors when managing accounts payable. The vendors desktop is located under the accounts payable category. Vendor setup is required in order to proceed with adding any vouchers and creating any AP checks. Begin by clicking Add Vendor. Enter in a vendor code. The code you enter should be specific to your organization. Enter in a short name for the vendor. Short name is also unique to your organization and can be useful when working with vouchers, as it can be a means for differentiating the vendors, especially useful when working with drop-downs when creating your vouchers. Next, enter the name for the vendor. This name should be entered as it needs to appear on the check. Although account number is not a required field, it is an important field that should be completed. Not only do you have the ability to search by vendor account number in the vendor search grid, but the account number prints on the check stubs as well. This number is typically the account number provided on your statements from the vendor, but can also be used as a memo field in the event you aren't provided a statement or an account number. The Apply to Employee Deductions checkbox allows for automation of vendor checks when payroll is run that correlate to employee deductions. This is valuable in that it reconciles all vendor payments to specific employee deductions, such as garnishments or particular benefits that are paid forward when withheld from an employee's check. It is important that in order for this automation to occur, the checkbox for the vendor must first be enabled so that the vendor name is available for selection at an employee disbursement. The AP vendor would be linked here, and the vendor is only eligible for selection when the checkbox is flagged. You will notice that when this checkbox is enabled, the number of days to pay field becomes active and required. This is where you will specify the number of days from the corresponding payroll check date in which to complete payment to the vendor. For instance, if you want to complete the payment to the vendor on the same date as the corresponding payroll check date, you should enter a 0. Entering in a 5, for instance, would set the scheduled date for the voucher 5 days out from the invoice date, which would be the equivalent to the payroll check date. Reports at the voucher's desktop can be run to manage the scheduled due dates to then pay the voucher. Generally speaking, if you want to pay the employee deductions the same day you run your payroll, leave 0. If the aggregate checks by vendor checkbox is selected, the system will sequence checks by check number for the vendor. This also is a setting that allows sub-vendors to be added to this main vendor account, which we will review in more detail in a minute. When adding sub-vendors and checking aggregate checks by vendor, you have the option when writing checks for multiple vouchers between the parent vendor and the sub-vendors, whether or not they need to aggregate to one check. You will always have the option of how those vouchers may or may not need to aggregate at the time of printing the AP check. The Send Reminder function allows for automated task reminders to be sent out as an alert when vouchers for the particular vendor are due. The control point for who receives these automated tasks is handled per role under the vendor section of desktop security. When choosing to send reminders, you will then need to select reminder dates. Notice that this is a multi-select drop-down so that multiple days of the month can be selected for the reminders to go out. Contact name and title are optional fields and can be entered if known for the vendor. The AP account field is required and auto-populates based on the GL Accounts Payable account identified under AP Rules configuration. This can be overridden per vendor if there is a need for multiple AP liability accounts. Tax ID number and default voucher description are both optional fields. Tax ID is important for any vendor in which you intend to deliver a 1099 to at the end of the year. Default voucher description is especially useful for quick keying of the voucher, as it is a system requirement to key a description for each voucher. In this example, for the rent vendor, rent may be entered as the default, and when creating the voucher each month, this automatically populates and can be edited, altered as needed. It is recommended that you check the stub code checkbox, as this will retain a stub for internal records. Inactivate is available in the event you need to inactivate a vendor. Be sure to enter in address details when checks will be mailed to the vendor. The address entered here will print with the check so that it can be stuffed into an envelope with the right size window. A contact information grid is available for adding multiple phone, fax, or email contact information. Distributing your voucher expenses is a requirement, and defaults may be established at the vendor level, again, for quicker keying when the distribution is consistent. For example, rent will most likely have the same allocation to the general ledger from month to month or voucher to voucher. Therefore, setting the default will reduce the keying every time this bill is due. Simply add the default distribution by choosing your base account, a cost center, optionally a service code and/or client, and then specify either a percentage or an actual amount of the distribution. If the amount varies from voucher to voucher, then simply put in a %1 indicating 100. All percentage numbers should be entered in their decimal representation, with the exception of 100. The system also accommodates multiple distribution methods. It is critical that your distribution adds up to 100%. It is worth noting that cost center can be set as required for the distribution. This is handled in AP list config rules. This is recommended anytime you have more than one cost center in order to have detailed financial reporting. The financial information section is mostly read-only. This section will auto-populate once bills are being paid to the vendor. Payment days, discount percent, and discount allowed days are all optional, but provide the means for applying discounts as needed for the particular vendor. ACH routing, account number, and account type are all available if you choose to ACH the vendor, meaning you will electronically submit the payment to the bank using an ACH file versus printing out checks. As mentioned earlier, the system supports sub-vendors. Sub-vendor accounts are important if you have multiple accounts or account numbers associated with a single vendor. For instance, you may have multiple office locations, each with individual accounts established with the same power company. Click Add Vendor to start adding the sub-vendor information. You will enter the vendor code, short name, name, and most likely the account number, along with any other vendor account information as we've already reviewed. When creating checks, you will then have the option as to whether you want one check for all vouchers associated with the vendor and the sub-vendor accounts. Be sure to save your vendor after all pertinent information has been keyed. You may search for vendors using the filters or globally searching for all vendors that have been added. Likewise, you may export this list in order to dump the vendors into a report or out into an Excel file or any other particular file. The last function on the vendor's desktop is the Quick Check function. Here, you can quickly create a voucher directly from the vendor information. Choose your vendor, and if you set the default description when adding the vendor, the description will auto-populate. As noted, you can alter this or update as needed. If the default description was specified when setting up the vendor, as in this case, it will populate. As noted earlier, edit as needed. The voucher number will auto-create by the system. Key in the invoice date, invoice amount, the invoice number, and apply discount type, discount amount accordingly. Likewise, a schedule date accordingly. If you intend to cut the check immediately, a scheduled date is not needed. Scheduled date is primarily used to establish the due date for sending the payment. Click Calculate to see the distributions. In this example, the default distributions were established and therefore the system auto-distributed. In the event you did not establish a default distribution method, simply add the distribution here before creating the check. Choose the cash account to create the check from, the check date, should you have any questions regarding the vendor's desktop, please contact support by going to Options, Support, and Contact Support.